I'm going to start off with a summary of why I decided to switch from the A7S3 to the Panasonic S5, because I know there's some people that just want me to get that right out of the way. Would appreciate if you watch the rest of the video, because I'm going to tell the story of how I got into this situation. But for those of you who don't want to do that, basically this is what I've decided. The Panasonic S5 always has much better image quality than the A7S3 at every single ISO value up to about 20,000. At that point, the A7S3 takes over and does such stuff that no other camera really can do. If you need to film a documentary in the wilderness with nothing but moonlight, with using nothing but the LCD screen to light your face, you can do that on the A7S3. You can't do that on the S5, but you can't do that on pretty much any other camera also. However, it will still look like crap. The S5 has incredible image quality. It's like a mini Alexa. Like you shouldn't be comparing this to the A7S3. You should be comparing it to the Alexa Mini LF. That's how good it is. And if you're filming in any kind of normal situation, like daytime or nighttime in a city or any place that has street lights or indoors, but there's enough light that you can see other people's faces, the S5 is going to deliver incredible image quality, much better than the A7S3. And even as somebody who wants to shoot in low light a lot, that's primarily why I decided to keep it. If you do need to shoot in with autofocus, the A7S3's autofocus is a little better. If you need to shoot in slow motion, then the A7S3, you should probably consider that one, because the slow motion options are going to be better on the A7S3 than this one, especially considering that I primarily only shoot in 24p, which means I don't need to worry too much about shutter speed and low light and stuff like that. So those are the reasons why you might want to consider the A7S3. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell a bit of a story about how I got into this situation of having two cameras despite being relatively poor and not being able to actually afford two cameras. So to start off, there's two things that you should know about me. The first one is I've always wanted to make movies, and the second thing is I've always really wanted to shoot at night. I've always preferred shooting night scenes because of storytelling reasons, because of image reasons. My first short film that I made in 2015 was shot at night on a train station. The only lights that we used were the lights of the train station and a reflector to try to reflect that light back into the talent's faces. But I was on a Canon T3i with an 85mm lens shooting, I think, at f1.4, and it was still just really rough, hard to get a good image out of that. So when I was in high school and the A7S was announced, and then the A7S2 was announced, like, everybody was talking about how incredible these cameras are in low light. Everybody was talking about, like, how just the amazing things that these cameras can do in low light. And so at that point in time, it sort of really got, like, drilled into my brain, like, I gotta get an A7S. Like, I gotta get one of these. And that was kind of like my first mistake. Like, I let this idea get stuck in my head that I needed to get an A7S camera. And if you take nothing else away from this video, I want you to take this away. Don't set your mind on a product that doesn't even exist yet, or that you haven't used yet. You don't know what it's like yet. Because that's what I did, and I ended up regretting it. So one of the reasons why I ended up regretting it is because, well, first of all, I was like just a poor high school student. I couldn't afford to get an A7S or an A7S2. So I decided that I would wait and I would get the A7S3 when that came out. So I tried to always save my money and try to have about $4,000 in my bank account so that whenever the A7S3 was released, I'd be able to buy it. And whenever I had that money in my bank account, I felt pretty good. Whenever I didn't have that money, I felt kind of bad. But For years and years, literally 5 years, the A7S3 was not released, and I didn't buy any cameras. I didn't upgrade my gear at all. I just kept using that Canon T3i, but I had less motivation to shoot, partly because I didn't have the nicest camera. Probably shouldn't have done that. I probably should have upgraded to something like a GH4 or GH5, but I wouldn't have thought to do that because I was so fixated on getting that A7S3, because I had that drilled into my mind that I had to get an A7S3. So fast forward to 2020, and the A7S3 is finally announced, and I'm broke and unemployed, so I have to get a job and start working retail full-time, which I did for several months, probably too long, because I started to have mental health effects from it, not very good ones, but I kept it in my mind, like, I have to get the A7S3, I have to get enough money to, have the A7S3. And I did. I was able to make enough money to buy an A7S3 with plenty of money extra as well. And I started using it, and from right away, my experience with the A7S3 was kind of disappointing. I always had a hard time going out and getting good quality images off of it. I think one thing that in particular that I always found is that ISO 12800, which everybody talked about, like, oh man, it gets so clean at ISO 12800. Well, it's still pretty soft. It's pretty soft, and it definitely doesn't look nearly as clean as ISO 640. But beyond that, I just didn't know how to shoot on a log camera. There was so much I didn't know, and the A7S3 did not make it easy for me to learn those things. It was not an easy camera for me to use, and I just wasn't able to get the best quality images off of it, and I had a hard time with it, and I had a relatively disappointing experience using it. Every time I would go out and shoot, I would be worried about what the footage would look like when I came back, and that never really went away, even as I learned more and more about how to use the camera, because the colors are weird, the white balance is weird. I didn't really know if I was going to always have the best quality footage when I got back home. So the reason why I bought a different camera is a little surprising. I actually ended up getting really deep into anamorphic shooting. I bought an anamorphic lens, the ISCO Ultrastar red anamorphic adapter, and I started using it on my A7S3, and I was kind of disappointed with the results, especially in low light. If you're using the A7S3 in 4K, you're making the most of the resolution of that camera, and it can look pretty good. But if you're dividing that resolution almost in half, which is what I was doing with that 2x anamorphic adapter, you're losing a lot of detail, and if it's in low light, it gets even worse because of the forced noise reduction on the A7S3. It makes the footage look a lot uglier. It just destroys so much detail. And so I could never get what I felt like was a really good image off of the A7S3 in anamorphic. So I decided, I thought about it for a while. I thought about getting a GH5, but eventually I looked at the Panasonic S5, which would be in full frame, so it would mean that I would still have some low light benefits because I really care about shooting in low light. So I looked at the S5. There were some low light tests out there, but nothing that felt really substantial to me. The only way for me to know was for me to get my hands on one and try it, so I did. I had some money left over from the A7S3, and I bought an S5. And that's what I'm filming on right now. I don't know if you had been guessing which one, but I'm filming right now on Panasonic S5 at ISO 4000. And basically, after I started using the S5, I just had a much better experience. Every time I would go out and shoot footage, I would come back and be impressed by the footage that I'd been getting instead of disappointed. There's so many things about the S5 that surprised me in how much easier it was to work with. I only got it in the first place because of its anamorphic benefits, because of its higher resolution sensor and its anamorphic modes. But I ended up finding pretty much everything about the camera to be a better experience for me. So, for example, the image quality is so much better. It's a much sharper and crisper image that's downsampled from 6K as opposed to the A7S3's image, which is downsampled from 4.2K. So it's a much cleaner image, but it doesn't look over sharpened. It looks soft and smooth, like surprisingly so. Maybe not quite the way the Alexa looks, but it does look like a very pleasing image, like a movie quality image almost to it. Another benefit of the S5 that adds to that higher resolution image is the fact that you can turn off noise reduction completely. You cannot turn off noise reduction on the A7S3, and it's really aggressive. The A7S3 has really aggressive noise reduction, which destroys detail in the image, and the only way to get rid of it is to film in ProRes RAW externally with the Ninja 5, which I did, and I had some good experiences. Like, it does create good quality image, but it's still not amazing, you know. But the S5's image, the 10-bit internal image, it's better than the ProRes RAW on the A7S3. It looks better, and it's easier to grade. Or, I mean, maybe it's about as easy to grade as the ProRes RAW, but it's so much easier to grade than the A7S3 because the colors are better, the white balance works better. I don't even know how it just works better. And here's the thing. If you mess up your white balance on the S5, I can literally adjust the colors so much in post and push them wherever I want to. I can just fix white balance in post. I can't do that on the A7S3. The latitude in the image, like if I mess up the highlights, I can usually fix them on the S5. I usually can't really do that to the same extent on the A7S3. Like for some, statistically I think there's supposed to be more dynamic range in the A7S3, but there's just something about the highlight recovery on the S5 that's so much better and makes for so much cleaner images and more beautiful images, better color, much better color you can get off of this camera. In the low light performance, this is important. So, as I've said, the A7S3 forced noise reduction really causes a problem when you're shooting in low light. It destroys detail, and even at the 12,800 second base ISO, it's still like is very soft. In my opinion, it almost feels like they've increased the level of noise reduction at that point to make it look even better, but it's like more noise reduction. I'm going to just say the A7S3 looks worse, much worse, than any camera should at most spots on the ISO range up till, well, 12,800, but then again, even slightly beyond that. The S5 looks so much sharper and so much cleaner at every single spot on the ISO range, even all the way to 12,800. I did a test recently where I compared a setup like this where I'm filming myself at 12,800 ISO on the S5 and the A7S3. It is kind of an optimal setup because I have lights all over. But the S5 looked better. It was sharper and cleaner and had better color. And it kind of destroyed, like, why would you not go for this camera? Well, it does have some advantages, the A7S3. Extreme low light, as I mentioned, if you are in a situation where you have basically no light and you really, really need ISO performance that just is like practically night vision goggles, it will look crappy, like it'll look extremely noisy and bad, but that's what that's what the A7S3 can do. It can do that. It's pretty good at that. No other camera really can do that, you know, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And the A7S3 does it pretty good. You can get a relatively clean image off of it. But do you really need that? That's the question. I mean, most things that you might want to film with a camera can be filmed easily within the ISO range of the Panasonic S5. I mean, and you'll get better quality, much better quality image off of the S5 than on the A7S3. Other advantages the A7S3 have, there's autofocus. The autofocus is complicated. So for me, I don't personally use autofocus all that much. I wouldn't rely on it in a professional setting. I know some people would, but maybe if they're Sony users, they would. The Panasonic's autofocus is not, well, the S5 in particular with the 20-60 lens, which is the only one I've tested, it's not terrible, it's just slow. I have to do more testing to figure out if there's better settings for it, but I feel like it's sort of slow to acquire, but once it acquires, it holds you. But again, I'm not the most experienced with the autofocus. The only reason why I need autofocus is to film a video like this of myself where I can't be manually focusing. But the A7S3 does have a faster autofocus, but it works really good on faces, I think, in optimal lighting settings. If it's in the dark, you're not going to get as good performance on the A7S3, and if you're not filming a human face, it's going to hunt on you, just like pretty much any other camera system. But the A7S3, I've had shots ruined because it was hunting while I was filming a landscape or something. So that's something to consider. The A7S3, everyone says the autofocus is really good, but it's not perfect. It does have problems. And either way, I wouldn't trust autofocus for a professional shoot. I only need it for filming a video like this. And as far as slow motion, again, I don't really use slow motion all that much. Primarily, I film in 24p, but if you do need to film in slow motion, the A7S3 has much more options for you, including 4K 120. And because of its low light performance at 12,800 ISO, you can get better low light results in slow motion, because in slow motion you have to cut your shutter speed in half, so it's gonna cut the amount of light that you can get in half. So that's why the A7S3 is gonna be helpful if you're shooting slow motion. But again, I don't really need to do that. I don't really need the autofocus. The A7S3 is a lot more expensive, and I kind of need the money right now. I mean, as I said, I ended up not having, I was broke and unemployed, and then I had to make all this money to get these cameras, and then that money's starting to run out now, and I need stuff. I need to upgrade my car. I need stuff like that. So for that reason, I've decided there's really no reason for me to keep the A7S3. Alright, I was just editing this video, and I just want to add a couple more things. First of all, I think the S5 and the A7S3, as far as settings and options go for, you know, fine-tuning your image, but also just convenience settings and stuff like that, the S5 is generally better in my opinion, but it's not perfect. There's a lot of natural improvements in the settings on the S5 that are confusing that the A7S3 doesn't have them, like shutter angle, for example, you can do on the S5 and stuff like that. But it's also, there's some weird differences where, like, for example, when you're switching from video mode to photo mode, it keeps some settings like your picture profile and other stuff like that, your exposure settings, which is a little confusing why that's still included. That's really, it's kind of a hassle to deal with. It's so much of a hassle that I actually used up a function button to switch to vlog or back from vlog, so that basically lets me switch to photo mode more easily. On the A7S3, that's not a problem. You just switch between them, and they have their separate settings for each one. So I do hope they would add separate settings for photo mode and video mode. That seems like a really simple problem. There's some other issues, like, for example, custom mode dials. This is the same issue you find on the A7S3 and on the S5, where custom mode dials, they save your settings, but there's not much flexibility. Every time you switch back to the custom mode dial, it'll go back to your same exposure settings that you use when you started up that custom mode. I didn't use the custom modes too much in the A7S3, so I might be wrong about this, but I do think that was like kind of the same. But I don't like that. I really wish it would keep your exposure settings when you go into custom mode, but not when you go into photo mode, I guess. Whatever. Setting functions to buttons, button macros. So the S5 generally is better about having buttons in the right places that let you have access to all the functions that you need. That's really helpful, I think, especially you have right on the front, you have the ISO, white balance, and exposure buttons right there. That's pretty handy. However, there's a big difference between the A7S3 and the S5 in setting these button macros, which is a lot of times the A7S3 will let you set a button macro so that you can just press the button and it automatically triggers the function. So if you want to do, like, for example, autofocus on or off, you just press the button and it triggers it. But if you set it on the S5, you press the button, it'll open a menu on the screen for you to select the option, which is kind of a hassle because it means you can't change these easily while you're filming. You have to go into a menu and select them that way. I do think that's kind of a hassle. It's not a super big issue, but it's one of the most jarring issues about switching from the menu system of the A7S3 to the S5. That's kind of a problem. Other issues, rolling shutter. There's no other way to put it. The rolling shutter is better on the A7S3. It's a lot better. The S5 has very noticeable rolling shutter. It's even more noticeable when filming in anamorphic. However, in filming in anamorphic, the A7S3 doesn't do much better either because it doesn't have an anamorphic stabilization mode, which the S5 does. That's another thing I should mention. The stabilization is much better on the S5. It looks much smoother and cleaner to use. It looks like you're using a shoulder rig almost. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than the active stabilization on the A7S3, and it does not have a crop, which the A7S3's active stabilization does. So that's another thing that's better on the S5. One major advantage for the A7S3, which I didn't talk about, but it's kind of a big one, is lens selection. There's much more lenses for the E mount for the A7S3 than there are for the S5 and the L mount. That could be a huge deal for you if you care about having native lenses or Sony autofocus lenses. And there's a lot of great lenses out there for Sony, a lot of great options. The L mount is getting better with lenses. They have a roadmap which plans out a lot of pretty essential lenses that are coming for the Panasonic line. There's a lot of Sigma lenses out there. The lens that I'm looking forward to the most is the 24mm f1.8. I really want to get my hands on that lens. In general, the A7S3 has smaller and more compact lenses, so that's something else to consider. I think that the A7S3, just a few more thoughts on the A7S3. I think I just got so sentimentally attached to the idea of owning this camera that over the course of 5 years it built up so much in my mind to the point that even letting go of it now that I have it is a little hard, because come on, it's the A7S3. I waited for it for 5 years and now I'm going to sell it, I'm going to let go of it. And so it's complicated, these things, they are emotional decisions, and there's more to them than just practicality. And in this case, I kind of let emotion get the best of me with choosing this camera. I was even considering the S5 before I purchased the A7S3, but I don't feel like I did enough research on it, because if I did, I might have decided to get this camera instead. The A7S3, like, the body, like, externally, it's very pretty to look at. Like, it's beautifully constructed, which in my opinion is a negative thing, because it makes me not really take it seriously as a tool. It makes me just want to, like, hold it or look at it, but it makes me kind of ignore the things that I don't like about using the camera as a tool. It makes me not want to keep a cage on it all the time, despite the practicality of having a cage on all the time. The S5 is a little bit uglier, but not I wouldn't say uglier, it's like a different aesthetic. It's a more rugged aesthetic, but it's just a more rugged construction in general. It feels like a tool, and I'm totally comfortable keeping the cage on that camera all the time because it makes it feel even more like a tool, like a usable, rugged tool that does what I need it to do. So that's the thing, is like I got sentimentally attached to a piece of hardware that didn't even exist, that hadn't even been announced by Sony yet. And that affected emotionally my decision making to cause me to buy a tool that didn't give me as good of an image as what I really wanted. I mean, there's so much more about the S5 that I love that the A7S3 doesn't have. It has DCI 4K, it has the anamorphic modes. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is these decisions, they are important and they are emotional decisions, but you have to understand everything's vying for your attention these days. Every single one of these cameras is amazing, and it's hard to go wrong with any of them, you know, but don't get too caught up in the decision making, because that's what I do. That's like, I always get caught up in the decision making. I'm extremely indecisive, and sometimes these decisions can be a huge source of anxiety for me, and this whole process of finding the right camera has been a huge source of anxiety for me. But I do feel really confident about the S5 now. I think the image quality that I can get off of this is really spectacular, and I've also learned a lot more about how to make videos, and I've learned stuff like maybe you should just light your scene better. But I've learned a lot more about how to use this camera. So yeah, that's why I'm going to sell my A7S3. And if you would like to buy my A7S3, I'm going to put the eBay link in the description. I don't know. It hasn't sold yet, so that's all I have to say. Choose your cameras wisely. That's all I'm going to say.